Hello, wildlings. I'm your Creepsmith, and you found my Fear Forge. Lucky you. Sometimes when a relationship is souring or ending, we find ourselves more eager to believe rumors that are unfavorable or even frightening. But when we find out they're true, that's a whole other enchilada. Continuing on, tonight's story, Gramma, by Titan of Terror, Stephen King. When he asked Mom, her face had gone very still, and her hands had paused over the solitaire clock face of cards she'd been laying out. "Do you think that's a good thing for you to be doing, Georgie? Do you and your brother make a habit of eavesdropping over the register?" George, then only 9, had hung his head. "We like Aunt Flo, Mom. We wanted to listen to her a little longer." This was the truth. Was it Buddy's idea? It had been, but George wasn't going to tell her that. He didn't want to go walking around with his head on backwards, which might happen if Buddy found out that he had tattled. No. Mine. Mom sat silently for a long time. Then she slowly began laying her cards out again. "Maybe it's time you did know," she'd said. "Lying's worse than eavesdropping, I guess, and we all lie to our children about Grandma. And we lie to ourselves, too, I guess. Most of the time we do." And then she spoke with a sudden, vicious bitterness that was like acid squirting out between her teeth. He felt her words were so hot they would have burned his face if he hadn't recoiled. "Except for me, I have to live with her, and I can no longer afford the luxury of lies." So his mom had told him that after Grandpa and Grandma had gotten married, they had had a baby that was born dead. And a year later, they'd had another baby. And that was born dead too. And the doctor told Grandma that she would never be able to carry a child to term, and that all she could do was keep on having babies that were dead or babies that died as soon as they sucked air. That would go on, he said, until one of them died inside her too long before her entire body could shove it out, and it would rot in there and kill her too. The doctor told her that. Not long after, the books began. Books about how to have babies? But Mom didn't or wouldn't say what kind of books they were, or where Grandma got them, or how she knew where to get them. Grandma got pregnant again, and this time the baby wasn't born dead, and the baby didn't die after a breath or two. This time, the baby was fine. And that was George's Uncle Larson. And after that, Grandma kept getting pregnant and kept having babies. Once, Mom said, Grandpa had tried to make her get rid of the books to see if they could do it without them, or even if they couldn't, maybe Grandpa figured they had had enough yowins by then so it wouldn't matter. And Grandma wouldn't. George asked his mother why, and she said, "I think that by then, having the books was as important to her as having the babies." "I don't get it," George said. "Well," George's mother said, "I'm not sure I do either. I was very small, remember. All I know for sure is that those books got a hold over her. She said that there would be no more talk about it, and there wasn't either, because Grandma wore the pants in our family." George closed his history book with a snap. He looked at the clock and saw that it was nearly 5. His stomach was grumbling softly, and he realized suddenly, and with something very like horror, that if Mom wasn't home by 6 or so, Grandma would wake up and start hollering for her supper. Mom had forgotten to give him instructions about that, probably because she was so upset about Buddy's leg. He supposed he could make Grandma one of her special frozen dinners. They were special because Grandma was on a salt-free diet. She also had about 1,000 different pills. As for himself, he could heat up what was left of last night's macaroni and cheese, and he poured a lot of catsup on it. It would be pretty good. He got the macaroni and cheese out of the fridge, spooned it into a pan, and put the pan on the burner next to the tea kettle, which was still waiting in case Grandma woke up and wanted what she sometimes called a cup of cheer. George started to get himself a glass of milk, paused, and picked up the telephone again. And I couldn't even believe my eyes when Henrietta Dodd's voice broke off and then rose shrilly. Who keeps listening to this line, I'd like to know? George put the phone back on the hook in a hurry, his face burning. She doesn't know it's you, Stoop. There's 6 parties on the line. All the same, it was wrong to eavesdrop, even if it was just to hear another voice when you were alone in the house, alone except for Grandma, the fat thing that kept sleeping in the hospital bed in the other room, even when it seemed almost necessary to hear another human voice because your mom was in Lewiston and it was going to be dark soon. And Grandma was in the other room, and Grandma looked like, yes she did, a she-bear that might just have one more murderous swipe left in her old clotted claws. George went and got the milk. Mom herself had been born in 1930, followed by Aunt Flo in 1932 and Uncle Franklin in 1934. Uncle Franklin had died in 48 of a burst appendix, and Mom sometimes still got teary about that and carried his picture. She liked Frank the best of all her brothers and sisters, and she said there was no need for him to die that way, of peritonitis. She said that God had played dirty when he took Frank. George looked out the window over the sink. The light was more golden now, low over the hill. The shadow of their back shed stretched all the way across the lawn. If Buddy hadn't broken his dumb leg, Mom would be here now, making chili or something, plus Grandma's salt-free dinner, and they would all be talking and laughing, and maybe they'd play some gin rummy later on. George flicked on the kitchen light, even though it really wasn't dark enough yet. Then he turned on the heat under his macaroni. His thoughts kept returning to Grandma, sitting in her white vinyl chair like a big fat worm in a dress, her corona of hair every crazy which away on the shoulders of her pink rayon robe, holding out her arms for him to come, him shrinking back against his mom, bawling, "Send him to me, Ruth. I want to hug him." "He's a little frightened, Mama. He'll come in time." But his mother sounded frightened, too. Frightened? Mom? George stopped, thinking. Was that true? Buddy said your memory could play tricks on you. Had she really sounded that frightened? Yes, she had. Grandma's voice was rising peremptorily. "Don't coddle the boy, Ruth. Send him over here. I want to give him a hug." "No, he's crying." And as Grandma lowered her heavy arms, from which the flesh hung in great dough-like gobbets, a sly, senile smile had spread over her face, and she'd said, "Does he really look like Franklin, Ruth? I remember you saying he favored Frank." Slowly, George stirred the macaroni and cheese and ketchup. He hadn't remembered the incident so clearly before. Maybe it was the silence that had made him remember. The silence and being alone with Grandma. So Grandma had had her babies and taught school, and the doctors were properly dumbfounded, and Grandpa carpentered and generally got more and more prosperous, finding work even in the depths of the Depression, and at last people began to talk, Mom said. "What did they say?" George asked. "Nothing important," Mom said, but she suddenly swept her cards together. "They said your Grandma and Grandpa were too lucky for ordinary folks, that's all. And it was just after that that the books had been found. Mom couldn't say more than that, except that the school board had found some, and that a hired man had found some more. There had been a big scandal. Grandpa and Grandma had moved to Buxton, and that was the end of it. The children had grown up and had children of their own, making aunts and uncles of each other. Mom had gotten married and moved to New York with Dad, who George could not even remember. Buddy had been born, and they'd moved to Stratford, and in 1969 George had been born, and in 71 Dad had been hit by a car, driven by the drunk man who had to go to jail. When Grandpa had his heart attack, there had been a great many letters back and forth among the aunts and uncles. They didn't want to put the old lady in a nursing home. and she didn't want to go to a home. If Grandma didn't want to do a thing like that, it might be better to accede to her wishes. The old lady had wanted to go to one of them and live out the rest of her years with that child. But they were all married, and none of them had spouses who felt like sharing a home with a senile and often unpleasant old woman. All were married, that was, except Ruth. The letters flew back and forth, and at last George's mom had given in. She quit her job, came to Maine to take care of the old lady. The others had chipped together to buy a small house in the outer Castle View where property values were low. Each month they would send her a check, and she could do for the old lady and for her boys. What's happened is my brothers and sisters have turned me into a sharecropper, George could remember her saying once, but he didn't know for sure what that meant. But she had sounded bitter when she said it, like it was a joke that didn't come out smooth in a laugh, but instead stuck in her throat like a bone. George knew because Buddy had told him that Mom had finally given in because everyone in the big, far-flung family had assured her that Grandma couldn't possibly last long. She had too many things wrong with her. High blood pressure, uremic poisoning, obesity, heart palpitations to last long. It would be 8 months, Aunt Flo and Aunt Stephanie and Uncle George, after whom George had been named, all said. A year at most. But now it had been 5 years, and George called that lasting pretty long. She had lasted pretty long, all right, like a she-bear, in hibernation, waiting for what? You know how to deal with her best, Ruth. You know how to shut her up. George, on his way to the fridge to check the directions on one of Grandma's special salt-free dinners, stopped cold. Where did that come from? That voice speaking in his head. Suddenly, his belly and his chest broke out in goose flesh. He reached inside his shirt and touched one of his nipples. It was like a little pebble, and he took his finger away in a hurry. Uncle George, his namesake uncle who worked for Sperry Rand in New York. It had been his voice. He said that when he and his family came up for Christmas 3 years ago. She's more dangerous now than she's senile. George, be quiet. The boys are around somewhere. George stood by the refrigerator, one hand on the cold chrome handle, thinking, no, remembering, and looked out into the growing dark. Buddy hadn't been around that day. Buddy was already outside because Buddy had wanted the good sled. That was why. They were going sliding on Joe Camber's hill, and the other sled had a buckled runner, so Buddy was outside, and here was George hunting through the boot and sock box in the entryway looking for a pair of heavy socks that matched. And was it his fault that Mother and Uncle George were talking in the kitchen? George didn't think so. Was it George's fault that God hadn't struck him deaf, or, lacking the extremity of that measure, at least located the conversation elsewhere in the house? George didn't believe that either. As his mother had pointed out on more than one occasion, usually after a glass of wine or two, God sometimes played dirty. You know what I mean, Uncle George had said. His wife and his 3 girls had gone over to Gates Falls to do some last-minute Christmas shopping, and Uncle George was pretty much in the bag, just like the drunk man who had to go to jail. George could tell by the way his uncle slurred his words. You remember what happened to Franklin after he crossed her? George, be quiet or I'll pour the rest of your beer right down the sink. Well, she didn't really mean to do it. Her tongue had just gotten away from her. Peritonitis. George, shut up. Maybe, George remembered himself thinking vaguely, God isn't the only one who plays dirty. Now he broke the hold of those old memories and looked in the freezer and took out one of Grandma's dinners. Veal, with peas on the side. You had to preheat the oven and then bake it for 40 minutes at 300 degrees. Easy. He was all set. The tea was ready on the stove if Grandma wanted that. He could make tea or he could make dinner in short order if Grandma woke up and yelled for it. Tea or dinner, he was a regular two-gun Sam. Dr. Arlander's number was on the board in case of emergency. Everything was cool. So, what was he worried about? He had never been left alone with Gramma. That was what he was worried about. "Send the boy to me, Ruth. Send him over here." "No, he's crying." "She's more dangerous now. You know what I mean." We all lie to our children about Gramma. Neither he nor Buddy, neither of them had ever been left alone with Gramma, until now. Suddenly George's mouth went dry. He went to the sink and got a drink of water. He felt funny. These thoughts, these memories, why was his brain dragging them out now? He felt as if someone had dumped all the pieces of a puzzle in front of him that he couldn't quite put together. And maybe it was good that he couldn't put them together, because the finished picture might be, well, sort of boogery. It might. From the other room where Gramma lived all her days and nights, a choking, rattling, gargling noise suddenly arose. A whistling gasp was sucked into George as he pulled breath. He turned towards Gramma's room and discovered that his shoes were tightly nailed to the linoleum floor. His heart was spiked iron in his chest. His eyes were wide and bulging. "Go now," his brain told his feet, and his feet saluted and said, "Not one bit, sir." Grandma had never made a noise like that before. Grandma had never made a noise like that before. It arose again, a choking sound, low and then descending lower, becoming an insectile buzz before it died out altogether. George was able to move at last. He walked toward the entryway that separated the kitchen from Grandma's room. He crossed it and looked into her room, his heart slamming. Now his throat was choked with wool mittens. It would be impossible to swallow past them. Gramma was still sleeping, and it was all right. That was his first thought. It had only been some weird sound after all, and maybe she made it all the time when he and Buddy were in school. Just a snore. Gramma was fine. Sleeping. That was his first thought. Then he noticed that the yellow hand that had been on the coverlet was now dangling limply over the side of the bed, the long nails almost but not quite touching the floor, and her mouth was open, as wrinkled and caved in as an orifice dug into a rotten piece of fruit. Timidly, hesitantly, George approached her. He stood by her side for a long time, looking down at her, not daring to touch her. The imperceptible rise and fall of the coverlet appeared to have ceased. Appeared. That was the key word. Appeared. But that's just because you're spooked, Georgie. You're just being silor el stupido, like Buddy says. It's a game. Your brain's playing tricks on your eyes. She's breathing. It's fine. It's just... she's... Grandma? He said, and all that came out was a whisper. He cleared his throat and jumped back, frightened of the sound. But his voice was a little louder. "Grandma? You want your tea now? Grandma?" Nothing. The eyes were closed. The mouth was open. The hand hung. Outside, the setting sun shone golden red through the trees. He saw her in a positive fullness then, saw her with that childish and brilliantly unhoused eye of unformed immature reflection. Not here, not now, not in bed, but sitting in the white vinyl chair, holding out her arms, her face at the same time stupid and triumphant. He found himself remembering one of the bad spells when Grandma began to shout as if in a foreign language, "Gyagan! Gyagan! Haster degrian yosothoth!" And Mom had sent them outside and had screamed, "Just go!" at Buddy when Buddy stopped at the box in the entrance to hunt for his gloves, and Buddy had looked back over his shoulder so scared he was wall-eyed with it because Mom had never shouted, and they had both gone out and stood in the driveway not talking, their hands stuffed in their pockets for warmth, wondering what was happening. Later Mom had called them in for supper, as if nothing had happened. "You know how to deal with her best, Ruth. You know how to shut her up." George had not thought of that particular bad spell from that day to this, except now, looking at Grandma, who was sleeping so strangely in her crank-up hospital bed. It occurred to him, with drawing horror, that it was the next day that they had learned that Mrs. Harem, who had lived up the road and sometimes visited Gramma, had died in her sleep that night. Gramma's bad spells. Witches were supposed to be able to cast spells. That's what made them witches, wasn't it? Poisoned apples, princes into toads, gingerbread houses, abracadabra, presto changeo. Spells. Spilled out pieces of an unknown puzzle flying together in George's mind as if by magic. Magic, George thought, and groaned. What was the picture? It was Gramma, of course, Gramma and her books. Gramma, who had been driven out of town. Gramma, who hadn't been able to have babies and then had been able to. Gramma, who had been driven out of the church as well as out of town. The picture was Gramma, yellow and fat and wrinkled and slug-like, her toothless mouth curved into a sunken grin, her faded blind eyes somehow sly and cunning, and on her head was a black conical hat sprinkled with silver stars and glittering Babylonian crescents. At her feet was a slinking black cat with eyes as yellow as urine, and the smells were pork and blindness, pork and burning, ancient stars and candles as dark as the earth in which coffins lay. He heard words spoken from ancient books, each word like a stone, and each sentence like a crypt reared in some stinking boneyard, and every paragraph like a nightmare caravan of plague dead taken to a place of burning. His eye was the eye of a child, and in that moment it opened wide in startled understanding on blackness. Gramma had been a witch, just like the wicked witch in The Wizard of Oz, and now she was dead. That gargling sound, George thought with increasing horror, that gargling, snoring sound had been a death rattle. "Gramma?" he whispered, and crazily he thought, "Ding dong, the witch is dead." No response. He held his cupped hand in front of Grandma's mouth. There was no breeze stirring around inside Gramma. It was a dead calm and slack sails, and no wake widening behind the keel. Some of his fright began to recede now, and George tried to think. He remembered Uncle Fred showing him how to wet a finger and test the wind, and now he licked his entire palm and held it in front of Grandma's mouth. No, still nothing. He started for the phone to call Dr. Arlander and then stopped. Suppose he called the doctor and she wasn't really dead at all. He'd be in Dutch for sure. Take her pulse. He stopped in the doorway, looking doubtfully back at that dangling hand. The sleeve of Grandma's nightie had pulled up, exposing her wrist, but that was no good. Once, after a visit to the doctor, when the nurse had pressed her finger into his wrist to take his pulse, George had tried it, but hadn't been able to find anything. As far as his own unskilled fingers could tell, he was dead. Besides, he really didn't want to touch Gramma, even if she was dead. Especially if she was dead. George stood beside the entryway, looking from Grandma's still bedridden form to the phone on the wall beside Dr. Arlander's number, and back to Gramma again. He would just have to call. He would get a mirror. Sure. When you breathe on a mirror, it gets cloudy. He'd seen the doctor check an unconscious person that way once in a movie. There was a bathroom connecting with Grandma's room, and now George hurried in and got Grandma's vanity mirror. One side of it was regular, the other side was magnified so that you could see to pluck out hairs and do stuff like that. George took it back to Grandma's bed and held one side of the mirror until it was almost touching Grandma's open, gaping mouth. He held it there while he counted to 60, watching Gramma the whole time. Nothing changed. He was sure that she was dead even before he took the mirror away from her mouth and observed its surface, which was perfectly clear and unclouded. Gramma was dead. George realized with relief and some surprise that he could feel sorry for her now. Maybe she had been a witch, maybe not. Maybe she had only thought she was a witch. However it had been, she was gone now. He realized with an adult's comprehension that questions of concrete reality became not unimportant but less vital when they were examined in the mute, bland face of mortal remains. He realized this with an adult's comprehension and accepted with an adult's relief. This was a passing footprint, the shape of a shoe in his mind. So are all the child's adult impressions. It's only in later years that the child realizes that he was being made, formed, shaped by random experiences. All that remains in the instant beyond the footprint is that bitter gunpowder smell, which is the ignition of an idea beyond a child's given years. He returned the mirror to the bathroom, then went back through her room, glancing at the body on his way by. The setting sun had painted the old dead face with a barbaric orange-red color, and George looked away quickly. He went through the entryway and crossed the kitchen to the telephone, determined to do everything right. Already in his mind he saw a certain advantage over Buddy. Whenever Buddy started to tease him, he would simply say, "I was all by myself in the house when Grandma died, and I did everything right." Call Dr. Arlander. That was first. Call him and say, "My grandma just died. Can you tell me what I should do? Cover her up or something?" No. "I think my grandma just died." Yeah. Yes. That was better. Nobody thought a little kid knew anything anyway, so that was better. Or how about, "I'm pretty sure my grandma just died." Sure. That was best of all. When it's so obvious, a kid can see it. How many times have you heard that phrase? Sometimes it seems like adults are always underestimating the intelligence of younger kids, when quickly assimilating and contextualizing information is a survival trait, especially for small, underdeveloped, or young people. Will it work, though? Come back next time to find out. Till then, stay scary, wildlings. GTFO when the old bag is yelling in Lovecraftian, and make the most of your nights.